Hello, this is Jay Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have SCOTUS weighs geofence warrants and the future of digital privacy from Reason.com, posted by Jai Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be involved with the internet or digital matters at all, just like with everything else. But ultimately, if they want to justify getting involved, they have the power to do so. I personally think the Libertarian position is if you want to have a geofence, you should be able to, but you shouldn't be forced to have one if you don't want to. Same with everything else. Next we have the monarchs, the moochers voting themselves the stuff of others, posted by Mazda Prophet, and that's a tweet from Geiger Capital, who tweeted, the California wealth tax is not on income, it's 5% of your net worth, it's state seizure of private assets, this is now on the ballot and likely to pass, realize where we are. And yeah, personally, I don't think the state should just be seizing 5% of your net worth, regardless of how much net worth you have. But, ultimately, if the state wants to take whatever it wants to, it has the legal monopoly and needs the force to do so. They're the ones who control the laws and legal system, and that just goes to show you, ultimately, if they want to take something, usually they can do it. And usually, if you want to fight back, you pretty much can't, because, they control the courts and legal system, so they define what is and isn't legal. When an individual does something, if an individual were to take 5% of everyone's net worth, it would be a crime. But when the state does it, it's just the law. And it's classic pirates and emperors. When a pirate does something, it's a crime. But when the emperor does it, it's just the law. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, surprise, surprise, Republicans want taxpayers to fund Trump's $400 million ballroom from thehill.com, posted by FastyWorthiness739, and that's crosspost from the anarcho-capitalism subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think taxpayer dollars should be going to Trump's $400 million ballroom, but ultimately, the U.S. government can justify spending whatever money it wants on whatever bullshit it wants. If it wants to spend $400 million on a ballroom in the White House, I personally don't care for that, but, that's just how it goes sometimes. Next we have, how is this considered free market? And that's a tweet from, or a post from Ragnarok XG, and it looks like a picture of all the companies, all the giant conglomerates who own all the food stuff. Like you got PepsiCo and all their brands, and Kellogg's and all their brands, and General Mills and all their brands, and Johnson & Johnson and all their brands, and etc., etc. And then they have the same picture in regards to the media and how pretty much the Walt Disney Company owns pretty much and Comcast pretty much own everything when it comes to the media currently. A few other companies as well, I think. But yeah, personally, I would say that's not really the free market. I would agree, because in the U.S., you don't really have a true free market capitalism. You have corporatism, where the government is embedded with big business, and that's why I think the libertarian position is you gotta get the government out of business, gotta have a truly free market. Ultimately, I think the libertarian position is you gotta be against big government, but you also got to be against big business. Ultimately, if a business is big just because of the government's help, I definitely think you got to be against that. I think the libertarian perspective is true capitalism requires competition, and right now we don't really have competition because of the government of the big business, big government consortium. And yeah, I think it's interesting, back in the early 2010s, people were catching on to that. The Tea Party said, all our problems are a result of big government, while Occupy Wall Street says all our problems are a result of big business. When in reality, all our problems are because of big business in bed of big government. And and that's why they have to push the culture war so much to keep the proles at each other's throats, rather than realize who's really running the show. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, but that's people's retirement, socialize corporate welfare at all costs, from youtube.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a YouTube video from But That's People's Retirement, posted by How Money Works. And yeah, personally, I think, the libertarian position is we shouldn't have corporate welfare in the first place. If people want to bail out the corporations with their own money, I think that's fine. But the government shouldn't be bailing out corporations. That goes against the free market. When I like how they said, when Obama bailed out the big banks during the financial crisis back in the late 2000s, they said, they're too big to fail. Well, the libertarian position is, if you're too big to fail, you're too big to exist, I would say. Ultimately, companies need to fail on their own merits rather than rely on government bailouts, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have more corruption. Blue states are suing to keep the feds from accessing how people are spending their welfare money on Ferraris, posted by Mazda Profit. And that's a screenshot of a tweet from Nick Sorter, who tweeted, WTF, the Trump admin found 14,000 food stamp recipients in a single state driving luxury cars like Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Maseratis per @Sec Rollins. We are constantly being ripped off. Put these people in jail and force them to repay every single penny. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that, but ultimately, sometimes people can get away with stuff if the government lets them do so. A lot of people are allowed to get away with fraud if they support the narrative enough, especially when it comes to people who grift off welfare. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, when it comes to the state can let some off the hook while going after others with the full extent of the law. It's how it's a popular term from the last couple of years has been narco-tyranny, and I think it definitely goes under that. Narco-tyranny, where some groups are allowed to do whatever they want, and the government lets them do it, while other groups are held to the full extent of the law because they go against the government's agenda. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Janine Pirro warns anyone bringing a gun into D.C. will be jailed, then claims, I'm a proud supporter of the Second Amendment, from WeGotThisCovered.com, posted by Woke Boogeyman, and that's a cross post from the Anything Goes News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really, I think, anyone should be able to bring a gun into anywhere they feel like, but, ultimately, if the government doesn't want to bring a gun to some building and wants to use force to do so, ultimately, that's how they can do it. I think libertarian positions, bring gun wherever you feel like, as long as you're not hurting anyone else without their consent. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have federal prosecutors have highlighted potential fraud of $9 billion in the state of Minnesota from Fox9.com, posted by Mazda Profit. And yeah, as I said in one of the previous posts, ultimately I don't really care for fraud, but if the government wants some people to get away with fraud and they don't want to charge them, ultimately sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Ultimately the government's going to support people in protected classes over people who it considers to be unprotected classes, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the problem with socialism is you always run out of other people's money, posted by Mazda Profit, and that's a tweet from Wall Street Mad, who tweeted, Sergey Brin timeline, 1979, family left Soviet Union to get away from socialism and communism, 2004 got rich with Google IPO in California, then funded and hired socialists for 25 years, 2026, after helping to ruin California, moved away and now claims he is against socialism. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, a lot of people, they'll say they're against one thing, but they'll do something that's the opposite, and it just goes to show you can't trust people. Like a lot of people these days, a lot of billionaires these days, the like Bill Gates or Sergey Brin or not all billionaires. Elon Musk used to be pretty voting for the Democrats, but ultimately I would say the libertarian position is you can't trust people just because of how much money they have or what they say. You have to trust. You have to go after their actions. And Sergey Brin might be making a genuine come to Jesus moment, so to say, when it comes to turning against socialism. But he's enabled socialism for the past 2 decades, as this tweet goes into, and I think that's important to remember as well. So definitely, ultimately, I would say if you want to trust him, that's fine, but you should definitely be a little suspicious of that as well. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have He's Right, posted by Gen Z Genji, and that's a tweet from a newsman who tweeted, the Republican pitch to voters in an election year dominated by the crushing cost of living in this country should be the urgent need for a new marble and gold ballroom for members of the American ruling class to have safer banquets. And that's them quoting Asen, who tweeted, Grandma Ballroom, if you don't think $140 million of tax money is a good investment to create a secure facility at the White House, then I disagree. I bet you 90% of Americans would love to have a better facility. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. But ultimately, if they want to throw money at a ballroom, will other people are desperate for cash. Ultimately they can throw whatever money they want to whatever bullshit they want, as I said, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it. Next, we have taxes will fix this. I guess more taxes will fix this. Was by Mazda Profit, and that's a tweet from Wall Street Apes. This is the Griffith Park pool in Los Angeles. LA Mayor Karen Bass is planning to renovate this pool. The cost will be $40 billion, and the time to complete is 3 years. The renovation will include a pool house with gender-neutral and inclusive changing rooms, only in California. And yeah, it doesn't look like that pool would cost $40 billion to refill, personally, for me, but ultimately the government can justify throwing money whatever bullshit it wants. Reddit cares when the out-group does it, like with Trump's ballroom, but when the in-group does it, Reddit will sweep it under the rug or say, well, that's entirely justified. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration's review of ABC's broadcast licenses look like illegal jawboning from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for, I think the libertarian position is you shouldn't have broadcast licenses in the first place. I don't think the government should be telling private companies what they can and can't broadcast, and it's only giving people like Jimmy Kimmel and ABC more power because no one really watches them anymore. People are more on social media these days, but Trump's such a boomer, he thinks late night TV is still the most relevant thing. Well, in reality, basically no one's watching them. If he didn't go after Jimmy Kimmel as much as he did, Jimmy Kimmel will be off the air by now. Same with Stephen Colbert, who's going to be off the air in a couple of weeks when it comes to his late night show. Next, we have Terminological Death of Libertarianism, posted by USMCBF, who said, since long text bad, I will keep this short. If libertarianism is too vague and you can concurrently exclude ideas from it, it means nothing because too many drastically opposing ideas are considered libertarian. It makes the term meaningless. Same for other terms. If you don't know exactly freedom is, it means nothing. If you cannot strictly find out free market is, it means nothing. If you cannot put coherent and justified limits on concepts of your understanding of libertarianism, how can you expect the resulting political power to limit itself? It can't. There is no philosophical limit. If you accept that the nature of political and moral philosophy is inherently inconsistent, relative, subjective, arbitrary, etc., you have no possible way to say this person is not libertarian because your beliefs make that sentence mean nothing. There is a significant number of people who this applies to, so just think about it, man. And I agree with that. Ultimately you need to define terms like liberty, libertarianism, freedom, free market, etc., because ultimately, ultimately I think the libertarian problem is that, definitions are, you can't have authoritarian definitions. People should be able to define words however they want to, and that just goes to show you, it can be kind of contradictory sometimes. If you want to consider yourself libertarian while also supporting like stuff like the Soviet Union or communist China, you should be able to. But ultimately, I personally would disagree if you would consider those not libertarian. And you do need to stand up against people who say, "Well, I'm libertarian, but I want the government to control everything." Just because you say you're libertarian doesn't make you necessarily so. It's a lot like how some people might say, "Oh, I identify as X." If you want to identify as like an other gender or another species for that matter, if you want to identify as a Pikachu, for all I care, you should be able to, but that doesn't necessarily make you that, and that should be the libertarian position. If you want to identify as whatever you want to identify, this is fine, but other people should be not forced to comply with what you identify as if they don't feel like it, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, in 1992, James Dale sued the Boy Scouts. Now Pete Hegseth presents a new challenge from YouTube.com, posted by Neat Concussions, and that's a video from Uncloseted Media, and they added in 2000, Boy Scouts America v. Dale was decided by SCOTUS, holding that the Boy Scouts could bar gay people from membership. Today, Scout America is far more inclusive, but that is under threat as Pete Hegseth and the Department of War threatens funding if the group does not roll back the clock on its inclusive gains. And yeah, personally, the libertarian perspective here is, this is a great example of why we shouldn't have government-funded or government-run organizations like the Boy Scouts, that just gives government too much control over them. If the Boy Scouts, or I think as they call themselves today, Scout America, would be private, I think that would solve all the problems. The government wouldn't have any control over them, and that's my thoughts there. Next we have Warhawk's credibility obsession makes America less credible from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally I would agree with that, but ultimately, if the government wants to say anything's credible or not, ultimately they can say whatever they want's credible, and oftentimes there's nothing to do about it since they're the ones in control of the definitions when it comes to words like credibility for that, and pretty much every other word as well. Next we have Republicans don't understand what political violence is, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Steve Hofstetter subreddit, and that's a tweet looks like a blue sky post from Brian Schaefer, who tweeted earlier this month at Tufts EDU senior Miles Kendrick, and I feel a survey at today.ugo.com to better understand what acts people think are political violence. There are some points of agreement and some clear differences of opinion, and then they have the study, it looks like, and yeah, it looks like there's some agreement, like physically assaulting politician official, both of them agree with that, 93%. Then declaring detaining in prison for political reasons, 77% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats agree with that. Armed attacks on protesters, demonstrators, 68% of Republicans, 95% of Democrats. using military against civilians, 34% Republicans and 89% Democrats. I personally would consider using military against civilians to be political violence. Then we have praising celebrating death of a public figure, 59% Republicans, 40% Democrats. I personally would consider that as be political violence. Free speech, means stuff that you don't like. If people want to celebrate Charlie Kirk's death or when Donald Trump's death, and if it ever happens, they should be able to. Ultimately, I think that's kind of scummy, but, celebrate whatever you want to. Then we have occupying public private spaces and protests. 56% Republicans and 26% yes, and 26% Democrats say yes. And I think, I guess you could consider that political violence. Depends of, occupying a space, you have to physically occupy it. You might have to use physical force to do so. So I guess you can consider that political violence. But yeah, I do think it's an interesting study, but, ultimately all studies are going to be bent to whoever's running them agenda is. And I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have Ted Cruz rips FCC over ABC broadcast license review following Kimmel joke. It's not government's job to censor speech from Variety.com, posted by Donald Key, and that's crossed from the Law subreddit. And I'd agree with that. Ultimately, Trump is only helping ABC and Jimmy Kimmel in particular gain more notoriety. They're increasingly the media of the past rather than the future. But by perseverating on them and trying to police their actions, Trump's making them much more relevant than they might otherwise be. I'm sure if he didn't bitch about Jimmy Kimmel at all, no one would care about him like they already did, and he'd be off the air by now. But since he constantly bitches so much about him, that it just goes to show you that he's the one who's really keeping him on the air, if anything. Next, we have It's Good to Be the King, using the federal government for Trump's personal interest, from Cato.org, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I don't really care about the government acting in its own personal interest, but, ultimately, that's people for you. They're always going to act in their own personal interest, right? It's fine when the Democratic administrations funnel money into their progressive NGO friends, but when the Orange Man does the same thing in regards to his friends and personal interests, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. It just goes to show people don't really have principles, only teams. Next, we have, let's see, where were we? Amid energy crisis of his own making, Trump slammed for using taxpayer money to cancel wind projects. We, the taxpayers, are going to pay companies $900 million to not build wind power at a time when electricity prices are spiking. Trump's opposition to wind power is becoming politically costly, from commondreams.org, and that's cross post from the energy subreddit, and that's posted by Woke Boogeyman. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, the government shouldn't be involved in energy matters, just like every other matter it shouldn't be involved in. If people want to pay for wind power, I think that's fine, but I don't think people should be forced to pay for wind power through taxpayer money if they don't feel like it. Same for any other power like solar or nuclear, etc., etc. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have why are MAGA and Republican Second Amendment supporters often in favor of constitutional violations, whether it involves the Second or Fourth Amendments, posted by Ragnar OKXG. And yeah, personally, I think, the libertarian position is we gotta support all the Bill of Rights, but, a lot of the uniparty position is we only support the Bill of Rights when politically convenient. It's like how the left says, oh, we're for freedom of speech, but that doesn't include hate speech and misinformation. Ultimately, I think, all speech is free speech, but, ultimately, it just goes to show you that, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are really, they can walk around them whenever they feel like it, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they're the ones in control of the state monopoly on the use of force. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have SCOTUS ends segregation when drawing congressional district maps, posted by Noam Sane, and that's a picture of the southeast United States, and it says current map, Democrats hold 24 seats in these states. Then it says possible redistricting scenario, Republicans getting 12 more seats, and then he links to the NPR article on that. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if voting mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. People are always bitching about, gerrymandering, well, being silent about what benefits their party. But regardless, I think it really doesn't matter. If voting mattered, they wouldn't let us do it, and that's definitely true when it comes to the House, the Senate, the presidency, etc., etc. Next, we have Imagine If the Founding Fathers Saw This, posted by Cattle Dog Curmudgeon, and that's a post from the White House, and it says Two Kings, and it's a picture of Donald Trump with a picture of King Charles III. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Donald Trump referring to himself as a king, but if he wants to refer to himself as a king and have the White House official account say that he and Charles are two kings, ultimately that's very much how he operates. It's like when Trump posts outrageous debate on social media the first time, it's okay to be concerned about it, but when he posts outrageous debate on social media for the millionth time, eventually you just kind of get numb to it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Have Trump's tariffs brought manufacturing jobs back to America? New study says no, from Reason.com, posted by Jedi Porcupine. And yeah, personally, I would agree with that. Ultimately, I think manufacturing, even with tariffs, is still going to be cheaper overseas than it is in the U.S., and that's just a harsh reality of life sometimes. I think tariffs are well intentioned, arguably, even if they are taxes, which I don't personally care for. They want to encourage people to support their local economy and bring manufacturing back to the local economy. But ultimately, I think all taxation is inherently theft, and that includes tariffs. So I think libertarian position, we shouldn't have tariffs. People should buy local, but ultimately, if people do want to buy cheaper goods from foreign sweatshops, they have every right to do so if they feel like it. Next we have about America's European identity, posted by Anarcho Federation, and that's a YouTube video from Portable Orange, and they added, and I hope he added, a lot of people these days want you to know America used to have a European identity. These are the same people who want to tell you that Mexico doesn't have a European identity, but I distress. But what would early Americans have thought about that? Why did their writings, letters, newspapers say? Was the American Revolution just never a European war, or was it the start of something new? And what did Europeans think about it when they met their long-lost kin again in the world wars? And yeah, personally, I think if people want to think America has a European identity, I think that's fine. People should be able to think about whatever America has, whatever identity it feels like. They feel like ultimately a lot of stuff when it comes to identity is going to be subjective or rather than objective, and I think that's important to remember as well. Next, we have 50 years of court-ordered racism was ended this week, posted by Mazda Prophet, and that's a tweet from the Babylon Bee, who tweeted, "And bloated Democrats, SCOTUS rules they have to stop being racist." And yeah, personally, I don't really care. As I said earlier, a lot of people are bitching about, the government can't do racial gerrymandering anymore. And personally, I don't think it really matters. As I said, if voting really mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. And it just goes, it doesn't really. It's just all for show. It's really just all. They all get along together behind the scene. It's George Carlin Fantasy's a big club you ain't in it. It's politics. It's basically electoral politics at this point. It's basically professional wrestling, I would say. It's all staged, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Democracy of Discord, was by Newlanders Gov. And yeah, I think they posted this in the last episode, but I'll read it again. We are political seminar and debate safer for people who want to debate, run for office, just a friendly community, powerful elected courts, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, personally, I think if the libertarian position is, if you want to have your own Discord server and have whatever rules you want, I think that's fine. But, you do have to obey the rules of the platform as well. It's interesting. I recently saw, on one of the previous posts, I saw this comment that was removed. It says, and one of the mods said, r/Libertarian Censors follows platform-wide Reddit rules. That domain isn't allowed on Reddit. And ultimately, I personally think, Reddit shouldn't be blocking access to domains it disagrees with for whatever reason. But ultimately, they're in a position to enforce that if they feel like it. And yeah, it's sad, it's quite a tragedy. Reddit used to be a platform for freedom of speech and expression, but now it's just a series of woke echo chambers. And that's why, I have to keep holding the subreddit accountable. It censored me for almost 2 years now, but they can't censor me here, regardless of how much they want to. I guess they could maybe report these videos if they felt like it, but, ultimately, that's their right to do so. But, ultimately, I think libertarian position means you gotta support your freedom of speech and expression for as long as possible. Next, we have Lindsey Graham wants you to pay $400 million for Trump's new ballroom, proposed by Jedi Porcupine. That's from Reason.com. And yeah, personally, I don't think that we should be paying anything for Trump's new ballroom. But if they want to pay for the $400 billion of taxpayer money, they should be able to. I think that's why I think taxation is inherently theft. If people want to pay taxes to something and earmark their taxes to go to wherever they want, they should be able to do so. But right now, we have people are forced to pay taxes, and they need to determine where the money goes to. And I think that's very anti-libertarian. Next, we have Louisiana governor proposes to suspend House primaries after court ruling from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. But, ultimately, if the government wants to suspend House primaries for whatever reasons it feels like, ultimately they have the ability to do so. The libertarian position is, if you want to market yourself as Democratic, you do have to have elections, and that does include primary elections. It's why Ukraine, they say they're Democratic, but even if they are at war with Russia, they haven't had an election in years now. I think that's important to remember as well. If you want to market yourself as Democratic, you have to have elections. I think that's important to remember as well. But regardless, I definitely do think democracy is just another form of authoritarianism, just because it's mob rule or tyranny of the majority, just because the majority votes one way doesn't make it right. If people wanted to arrest people for like being a homosexual, and the majority voted for it. Let's say that happened in a country like Uganda, that doesn't necessarily make it right, and I think that's important to remember as well. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.